Thank you, Ted. And it's such a pleasure to share this time with you this morning. And I'm saying this because I think you in early education, you've really changed the world. You know, there's a lot of further things that need to be still done in this field, but there has also been so much incredible progress over the last decade in the field of early learning in many countries, not in all, but in many countries. And I think this is because you have changed the mindset of people, made a case for early learning, and also provided policymakers with tangible solutions. I'm saying this because don't take this for granted. If you look at schooling has been pretty flat over the last 15 years. Very little progress, very little change in the way we work, but in the field of early learning, I really think we can talk about a lot of progress, and that's what I will try to do this morning. But there's a second reason why I'm really, really pleased to join you here, and that is, I think there's a lot we can learn from the best early childhood education and care around the world. And I think it will be well advised to actually look at some of those practices and see how we can actually level them up into schooling rather than using schooling and pushing it down earlier and earlier in the lives of children. Lots of really good and interesting pedagogical practices that we can learn from. But let me start from the beginning. And I'm just trying to get my slides working. There is, of course, a strong demographic pressure for change. Now, if you look at the chart here, fertility rates among OECD countries are now well below replacement level, which was very different in the 1970s. No? And you might think, well, what has this to do with early childhood education and care? But actually, if you ask, mothers, women, you can actually see, this is an example for Japan, the lack of affordable childhood education and care is the #1 reason why women say they do not have children in the case of Japan. Now, things have changing. Early education has become often more affordable, but still, it's still often an important barrier, It's not the case in Australia, but there are many countries in Europe where small children are the only ones that we ask to pay tuition. You wouldn't dare to raise the case of tuition in France, for example, for people who go to university, but we extract money from the very smallest. So there's still it's still an expensive kind of issue for most countries, and it's obviously one reason. We also see that, the risk of poverty, joblessness, is much more likely to strike you when you are in a single-parent family. So obviously that's another pressure on the demand. Australia is a great case in point. Now, this polarization is particularly strong for those kinds of groups. Last point. If you look at female employment in the 60s, you see that typical curve. When in the age group 25 to 29, women have children, then they stay home, and so on. When you look at this today, the curve looks very different across the OECD countries. So female employment has gone up. It's another kind of pressure on the kind of services that we need. And last point on this, actually that was sort of the case for better policies on this. And I want to look at 3 issues here. First of all, the dimensions of benefit. They are multidimensional. It's easy to look at the economic benefits of early childhood education and care. That's the most thing that can be easily measured. But I think it's also important to look at kind of broader social outcomes. Also, the ways in which we can support parents and, last but not least, giving children a strong start. It's amazing when you look at the research literature, most of the reasons for most of the cases for early childhood education and care we make because of our own, employment, earnings, returns, and so on. We rarely think about their children. I think we have to do better on that front to think about, what can we do for children when they are small in terms of giving them the strongest possible start. And I'm also saying this because this is an area where we can do better. Education in general, but early childhood education in particular, is the great promise as the equalizer, basically compensating for social disadvantages. But the reality is that often education, including early education, tends to reinforce rather than moderate social benefits. That's, I think, an important challenge that we still need to address. How do we attract the most talented people into the service centers that we're dealing with the most challenging children? Many countries can make a lot of progress on this. This is just bringing you back to the previous slide. There's a clear cross-country relationship between maternal employment, when the youngest child is under the age of 3, and on the vertical axis enrollment in early childhood education and care. Not a surprise, that's what you would expect. No. This is the famous Heckman curves. You've probably seen this in one of the other shapes, basically suggesting that the investment that we make in education bears the highest returns in the early years of children. And this is, again, not so implausible. Try to learn a foreign language at your age. You're going to invest a significant effort and time. You are 2 or 3-year-olds, and you're going to pick it up in the kind of natural environment. The kind of returns on this are always highest for many areas. This is not true for everything, but I think for many areas this is quite well intuitive, but it's also, I think, economically proven quite well that this is where we do best. Here's sort of part of the reason why. We can actually see in the evidence that for some of the skills, actually, there are finite windows. And this is something that research has only more recently shown. When you think about, for example, emotional control, you do that best in the sort of age group 1 and 2. When you think about, even some of the cognitive language, that is a very important window early on in the development of children. I'm going to show you some data in a moment suggesting actually the exposure of children to the number of words is one of the things most closely related to a social background. Numeracy, even that, peaks at the age of 3 to 4 years. And this is something that we have only recently discovered, and that's also suggesting, why it is so important that we move, from care to education, from access to quality in early childhood education and care. Now, because there are those finite windows, if we miss the window, for some children, of course, they have all of the support at home that you can imagine, but for those who do not, if we miss those windows, they will not come back. And I think neuroscience is actually advancing very rapidly in the field. Our understanding of this is rapidly improving. This is a chart which comes from our Pisa survey, where we can actually sort of mirror early childhood education participation in the scores that 15-year-olds have in the Pisa test in most countries. And this is not a true longitudinal study. This is simply looking at today's 15-year-olds and then the exposure to early childhood education and care they had when they were small. And there are two things that are really interesting. First is the magnitude of the difference. When you look, for example, 30 Pisa points, this is about the equivalent of a school year. So you can actually see in some countries we're talking about more than one school year of an advantage at age 15, based on simply having participated for more than 1 year in early childhood education and care. What's also interesting is in some of the countries with the highest, performance advantage in Pisa, the focus of early childhood education and care is not on cognitive development. It's not that you start to sort of teach the small children numeracy and therefore you see better numeracy outcomes at age 15. No, actually, some of the countries with the highest returns are ones that actually have an entirely different focus in early childhood education care. The advantage is even bigger when you don't discount for social background, which again shows us that often early childhood education and care reinforces social disparities. Now, in some ways, parents from better off economic backgrounds seem to be able to figure out the provision that is actually most conducive to outcomes. So that's basically where we are. There are strong economic, social benefits from early childhood education and care, but we need to do better to level the playing field. And this is really something that is important to me, important to us in the OECD. What can we do to, reach those with the greatest need with the best possible services? Let me show you a couple of points why this is so important. Of course, when you think about small children, the home environment is always a dominant impact. Your social economic status, your mother's education, your income, the home learning environment. All of those are very powerful factors shaping the development of children. That's no surprise because that's where they spend most of their time. So you'd expect most of the influence coming from their background. But you look at the effect of preschool here. It's more or less in the order of magnitude of primary schooling at age 11, and more or less of the magnitude of, father's education. So in fact, we do have really good evidence that even in terms of the cognitive development at age 11, preschool is one important factor. Despite the fact that children typically spend, what do you have in Australia? 15 hours per week. That's not in a very, very significant amount of time, but it's clearly visible in outcomes at primary schooling. This is the point I mentioned before, and that is really startling. When you look at the words a child heard per hour by family status, you can see how that varies. You basically come from a professional background, you talk to your child for 2,150 words, and if you come from on social welfare, it's barely 600 words. So there is an enormous difference coming from social background in terms of, and here you can see really how social background reinforces the kind of outcomes here. And, but again, this is also the opportunity for early childhood education and care to really make a difference. We know from research that actually the rate of return is highest for the children from the greatest disadvantage. Now, the previous chart illustrates why, because that's where you can make most of a difference. If you come from a wealthy background, you're going to have many chances in life, even if you don't do well in school or university. Now, there are many open doors that you find in life if you come from a privileged background. If you come from a poor background, a good early childhood education, a good school, is your only chance in life. You miss that boat, you're not getting a second chance. In most of our societies, now that's what all our data suggests, that basically where there are disparities in outcomes and the quality of learning and so on, they tend to just grow as people get older. And even after school and employment. Employers are least likely to invest in the skills, in the people with the lowest level of skills, because that's really hard work. Individuals who have been disappointed, disaffected in schooling and education are the least likely to continue learning throughout their lives. So there are many reasons why we see what we see, but this is sort of the reality. That's where we could be now. Investing in the most disadvantaged children with the best quality services really could give us the best returns. And this is the reality. Comes back to Pisa. It's one of the most sort of startling figures. If you are in an advantaged school, in virtually every country, you'll have much more exposure to early childhood education and care than if you are in a disadvantaged school. And in some countries, this gap is huge. It's in the order of several years of early childhood education. This tells us, the most privileged have still the best access. And that's true, in a country like Australia, which is actually intended to target services to disadvantage. But the reality is, it still works the other way around, in virtually every country. What we can also see here is, in absolute terms, how huge the gap is. If you are in Sweden and Finland, virtually everyone, even children from disadvantaged backgrounds who are in disadvantaged schools, have 3 to 4 years of early learning experiences. But if you are on the right side of the chart, this is actually a very, very small number of children. But keep this in mind, with all our intentions to target services, to also to raise the quality of services. The reality is still works the other way around. You're in an advantaged school, you're more likely to have had good early childhood education and care for longer. You are in a disadvantaged school, you actually miss out on that. So this suggests we need to do better, and I think we can do better on this. I think I'm going to come back to this when I talk about financing and provision. I think there are many mechanisms that we can use to really do better on this. Let me talk a bit about what we can do to move from access to quality. First of all, on the access front. Actually, this is the most encouraging picture I can show you. When you look at enrollment rates for children under the age of 3, in most countries we now talk about, 40, 50%. When I look at 3-year-olds, we talk about, more than 2/3 of children. When I look at 4-year-olds, it's pretty universal. And 5-year-olds, virtually every child is somewhere enrolled. If I had shown you this chart 10 years ago, you'd see a totally different picture. In many countries, 10 years ago, early childhood education and care was completely patchy. Some had it, some not, You can take big countries, Countries like Japan, countries like the UK, my country like Germany. Now, 10 years ago, very, very sort of patchy provision. Today, actually, there's pretty much universal access in those kinds of countries, at least for 3. Huge progress being made in terms of investing in the quantity. Now, some people say, well, that's easier to do in small countries than in big countries and so on. Well, to those, I show you the example of China. This is the progress that China has seen, over a generation in this up to the year 2010. This is the progress China has seen since 2010. This is a big country, but they have made this a priority. They have developed the services, they have rolled it out, and they have now basically reached more or less the standards of many OECD countries in terms of early childhood education and care. Still a lot of questions about quality of services and so on, but at least in terms of provision, basically providing most urban areas and many villages with early childhood education and care. You talk about a few years of time. So these are things that we can, with the right political will, you can make happen in a very short period of time. And again, an encouraging picture overall. Access, I think, is in really good shape across countries. Quality really matters. This is sort of something that is still very, very hard to measure. This is an index that's been used by research, and you can really see how, when you look at the cognitive academic achievement, it's really very significantly predicted by the quality of service, not just by access. What I showed you before on the Pisa outcomes, that was merely access. I didn't even count quality on this. The simple fact that children had participated gives them a huge advantage in school. But when you actually include the quality figure, then you can see that this is actually in a much steeper, much more important relationship. That's reflected in spending figures. In most countries, expenditure per child on early childhood education and care is now highest for the very young children. That's where group sizes really matter. You hear us at the OECD always saying, in school, class size is not that important. And that is true, and what our Pisa data show is that whenever you have to make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, go for the better teacher. Now, there's very, very compelling evidence around that. When you look at this in early childhood education and care provision, that's where you can actually see that group sizes do matter, because the relational aspect is so important. That immediate access to people is very important. And that's sort of gradually being incorporated in provision. The spending for the very young children before pre-primary actually is at very, very high levels. Australia is doing well on this chart, but keep in mind, this is only for the children who participate. This is basically spending. It's not average spending per average child, but this is spending per child enrolled in those kinds of services. And also keep in mind, a lot of that money comes from private sources in the case for Australia. But overall, if you look at the resources being invested per child, Australia is a good example of a country that has really got its act together in the last 10 years. The spending figures would look very low. If I would, later on, I'm going to show you data about salaries of people. Salaries are always a good predictor for the kind of people that you get and the quality that they can provide. 10, 15 years ago, Australia would have been at the lower end. Now Australia is in a good place. But overall, we can see there is now, for those children who go, quite a substantial amount of investment available. Now, what does quality mean? What can we do about this? And again, our measures of quality are still very patchy, but setting policy goals is something that we consider to be very, very important. Only if you make clear what the goalposts are, what you expect from those services, will you have a chance to reach this. Curriculum and learning strategies. This is something that's emerging in most countries now. There are curricular frameworks in place. Workforce quality, now the quality of provision can never exceed the quality of the people who work there. That's important. Family and community engagement, how you create those kinds of links, and this is generally positive. In fact, in most countries, the relationship between early childhood education care and families is much better than in the case of schooling now. And then data monitoring and research. Still a field where, we don't have compelling evidence around many of the issues that I'm talking about. I think we need to do much, much better to develop the right instruments, the right data to tell us more. But those are factors that are tangible, that we can work on to improve the quality. Just sort of coming back to the goals, this is really something that has happened as well. We now have in most countries clearly sort of spelled out reasons for doing this, and these are important instruments to consolidate public will. Now, why are we doing this? What's the value proposition? It's about aligning resources with those goals. Now, if you do not spell out your goals, it's very hard to do. It's also about building a broader and shared vision in society about this. Now, what are we really trying to achieve? And these are things that we take for granted in schooling. When you talk about schools, everybody knows, what schooling is about, what children are trying to achieve there. We have a very good regulatory framework for the quality of people. And it's actually hard to become a teacher in primary schooling. And all of those things are very well articulated. You go to early childhood education and care, something happens here, something else happens there. We don't even know very well what's happening. The fact that you find so many blanks in the tables that I'm showing you in the charts for countries, fundamental data is missing now. We don't have that kind of articulation. And then you ask yourself, why is that? It's only because, 200 years ago, somebody said, let's start schooling at age 6. Now, that's the only reason why it is like this. It's only because we've always done it like this. There's no intrinsic rationale why schooling life starts at a specific age. So these are really important kind of things to do. But let me talk a little bit about the financial parts of this, spending on early education. The first thing that strikes you really is that often our investment is inverse to the kind of function that we could have on the cognitive development of children. You saw that already before. Many of the windows for the development of important social, emotional, and also cognitive skills start very early. Now that's where sort of we can make most of a difference for children. But when you look at spending on health, education, income support services, and so on, you can see we are not doing very much at the beginning, and then those numbers pick up. So aligning, the potential that we have better with the resources that we can spend, I think is very, very important. And again, the lack of the evidence base is a good issue here. Some people say, well, why should I spend money on 2- and 3-year-olds? You can't show me really compelling evidence that that's going to make a big difference. Well, that's true. We don't have often, enough kind of at scale quantitative evidence. I actually believe there is a strong case for this. And if you look at sort of case research, that's very, very strong research. But overall, we have not yet developed the kind of robust evidence that we take for granted in other areas. We really need to do better on this to make sure that our resources match the opportunities that we have better. You can see that here for a number of countries in spending patterns. When you just look at education, you can see basically how front-loaded education is in the ages of, compulsory schooling. Little spending at the beginning, then sort of it peaks. That's where things become expensive. And then at the age of 20, we are again reducing our spending. Lifelong, life-wide learning looks differently. This is only because, we know what happens in those institutions. We have to pay for the salaries of people who are employed. That's what's driving costs. But it's not modeled around the potential and the learning needs of individuals. And I think that's true for in the early years, true for many cases. Again, aligning spending better with the needs of children and the development. Now, how to do that is really hard. You want to have universal support for everyone. You want to have targeted support, targeting those in greatest needs. And in fact, the truth may be a mix of this. You want to have every child have access to services, but you want to still target the quality of those services. You can make most of a difference for the children in the greatest need. So that's where actually, universality and targeted support do not exclude each other. They should be reinforcing each other. But it's a difficult question. If you have only a limited amount of money, do you want to compromise quality for universality? I think those kind of trade-offs are very, very hard to make. They really need to rely on good data. How much of access should be free? Now that's another question to ask. If you want to give universal quality at high, at relatively high cost, who should pay for this? Who benefits? No. In a way, it's puzzling why we ask this question in early childhood education and not in primary school, secondary school, or universities. No? Why do we only raise this challenge for paying for people for the youngest children? The answer is that's tradition. If you look at this from a rational point of view, that's the first place where we would spend public money, because that's where the public returns are greatest. No? If you charge tuition, you'd be much better off, if you have to do it at university or upper secondary schooling. No? But, this is a case that we have to ask. Should it be income contingent, means tested? Those kinds of issues are real. How many hours should be made free as an entitlement? No? Well, you can make the number of 15. That's basically just modeled around the needs of working people. But, those are questions that we should really look at. And the first thing you can do is actually see how this plays out in different countries. This is the hours of free access that people have, Kazakhstan, for some reason, is at the top of the list. Now, they have a lot of oil. They use that oil to actually pay for education. It's a good thing, and they give actually most children, a lot of hours of access. Slovenia, Czech Republic, Italy also, if we talk about 40 hours. But then you look at, England, it was just 15 hours. They're changing it. This is also a really good example where research evidence is making a difference. There's been sort of a lot of debate about this, for some time in 15 hours. Now people see actually we need more volume in this, and that's being done. But you can see it's still, and Australia is also still on the 15 hours. No, I just don't have the comparative data here. But so I think it varies. You can see here how that entitlement, the volume that we invest free, really varies. There are a few countries, I mark them here in blue, where the access is still conditional. No? That's sort of means tested. But you can see really that the legal entitlement varies enormously across countries. This is also something to keep in mind. In early childhood education and care, you find a lot more cross-country variation in those kinds of patterns than when you talk about schooling or university. We do not, and that suggests to me that we have not yet figured out, what is the best kind of model that people then can emulate and use across the world. It's still something that many countries struggle with in a very kind of domestically oriented field. You can also see that the incidence and length of early years participation are not aligned. Now you can see, for example, in the upper right corner, you can see how some countries have, many hours and lots of people participating. In the lower left corner, you have countries where few children participate at low hours. So those things are not automatically related. That also suggests to us there is no obvious, intensity incidence trade-off. No? It's not that in order to provide long hours, you have fewer children, but some countries do both and some countries do neither. No? I think that's something that I see here are the colors that I wanted to show. And then you can see how this really matters. Employment rates really go down depending on the number of hours. That's what you would expect. If you basically get more coverage for greater volume, it's easier to take a form of employment. And again, that's what you can see in the data, and that's one of the benefits that I discussed at the very early start. Where is this money coming from? In green, you can see the share that is paid by governments, and you can see in a fair number of countries, most of the investment now comes from the public purse. Again, 10 years ago, the figures look very, very different. And 10 years ago, private payments were the dominant share in many countries. Now, in most countries, things are publicly paid. But there are exceptions. Now, Australia is a good example, but also Japan, UK, Portugal, and so on. Costa Rica, Australia, there basically parents still pay a fair share of the bill. No? That's sort of something that varies across countries. But overall, you can see the green bars going up and up. I think most policymakers do now understand the importance of it, in particular to ensure that children with the greatest need have free entitlement of this. But it's important to see that we also see that reflected in, the ratio of teachers, and that's something that is in some countries. If you look to Chile, you have 25 children for every teacher in pre-primary education. Australia and Sweden look very good on those counts. Huge variability across countries. And again, are there trade-offs between the quality and quantity of personnel? Can you only hire fewer people if you pay them better? Those are issues that you can see here countries deal with in quite different ways. And of course, for the very smallest, that's the blue share of the bar, actually those numbers tend to be smaller. And there are, of course, when you talk about staff ratios, they should always be seen in context. There are actually some institutions, even with less favorable staff ratios, do amazing work when they focus on process quality and other areas. So I don't want to sort of make a religion around this, the staff numbers or group sizes. In some countries, some centers are very, very good in leveraging few people in an optimal way. But, on balance, those numbers still tell you something. I want to come to a topic that is really important to us in the OECD, and that is how do we make this shift from care to learning to development of children. And that's perhaps the most recent development. The initial emphasis has often been around female employment, taking care of children, and so on. And only recently does research really show how much we can do in the early years in terms of the social, emotional, and cognitive development. How do we foster that kind of shift? And again, it starts with curriculum. How can we frame in a clear and concise way what it is that we want to develop among the earliest? One of the temptations is, well, we know what we do in schooling, let's just do that earlier and earlier. That's often not the wisest choice. The country where my children go to school, France, starts with, early learning is more or less about like early schooling. But at age 15, France does not do particularly well on Pisa. Actually, teaching 3-year-olds coding and reading and writing is not necessarily a very effective way to actually foster their cognitive development in the long run. What is best developed at what age is very important. The curriculum is the instrument to do that. Now, that's how you can guide behavior. That's how you be clear to parents and spell out what the goals are. And to be positive on this, we now have in the majority of OECD countries some form of curricular frameworks on this. Here you have the data. In 26 out of 52 countries, we now have curricular frameworks. And in some countries, that's only for pre-primary, that's clear. Sort of the very early years are much harder to deal with. But in most countries, this is an emerging field where a lot of things has happened. There are a lot of unanswered questions now. For example, in preschool, do you take a more academically oriented approach or a more kind of comprehensive child development approach? Or, you focus on something that is more teacher-initiated or more child-initiated. And I don't think we have, at least not at scale, the evidence to answer this. What the data show is that on some fronts, the academic orientation seems to yield better outcomes when you look at IQ, literacy and numeracy, specific knowledge, obviously. Whereas on other fronts, the comprehensive approach seems to be superior. Now, when you look at motivation, the kind of non-cognitive outcomes, creativity, independence, and so on. So I think it's probably about finding the right balance, but I do think this is a field that requires a lot further research and a lot better metrics on learning outcomes. This is part of our problem that it's very, very hard to develop good measures of the social and emotional development of children in particular. And the cognitive outcomes are much easier to observe, much easier to assess. Space, location, accessibility, these are also obvious factors. If you start with the space, there are some really good examples, there are some poor ones, and there are also trade-offs. We know, for example, if you cram children in less than 2 square meters per child, it's destructive. If you put them into big spaces of more than 5 square meters per child, they get lost and sort of isolated. You don't have the kind of social interaction. So getting that right is sort of something that we have to really work on. Location, how do you bring early childhood education in school together? How do you make it accessible to children? Speaking about accessible even in the more immediate right, there are some really compelling examples. We studied actually examples of architecture recently. Child safety, obviously, how do you make sure that in whatever design you choose, you have always children in view? And I think that's something that needs a lot of thought. Flexibility in services. I think another area, if you talk about innovative learning environments, now how can you give those centers the possibility to design and shape their learning environments around, their pedagogical ideas and needs, and that obviously matters a lot more in early learning than in school. You wish schooling would become more like this, but scale. I think one of the things that we see often is that we put children, the smallest children, into rooms and facilities that are designed for adults. That's obviously not a good thing to do. You need to sort of keep in mind, how do you actually create the kind of scales that are adapted to the needs of children. And last but not least, visibility, creating spaces. But there are good examples around the world. I think this is a field where we have learned a lot, and you can see many promising practices around the field. Well, facilities is the easy part, that actually costs you very little. If you look at this share of spending on the physical infrastructure of early childhood education and care, you talk about, 5-7% of total spending, so you can actually have really great facilities at very little cost. The big cost factor is always the people, staff. Staff qualifications, how we educate them, how we build those kinds of competences, making sure that they do not only know their field very well, but that they have a good understanding of child development, the kind of things that we know from neuroscience, that they have a good understanding of the intended curriculum, they have the skills for problem solving, development of lesson plans, good leadership. Something that's only recently getting attention, at least leadership in early childhood education and care centers. Those things are very, very important. Working conditions, obviously key. If you do not provide adequate working conditions, you're not going to attract the kind of people that you want to have there. Staff stability, turnover, staff behavior, and so on. Those things are always interacting. And there is, again, a lot that we can do, not only to make this work financially more attractive, but also to make it intellectually sufficiently attractive, and to give people more opportunities to connect with other people working in the field, to connect centers, to create more of a profession in the field. That's emerging in the schooling sector, but in early childhood education and care, most people work pretty much in isolation in their center. So I think this is an area, raising the professional status of people working there is a very important thing. And you can see that this is basically, there's a lot of variation across countries. Now, if you look at the annual net teaching time and hours on the vertical axis and the number of days teaching per year, you can see, those who are in the lower left corner are the lucky ones. They don't have to work for many days and they don't have to teach for many hours. And those in the upper right corner have to do both at the very same time. And actually, one of the things that we see is that teachers in early childhood education and care, particularly pre-primary education, have a lot less time for other things than teaching than what you see in primary schooling. So we've actually squeezed out many of the more important professional development activities that are really of central importance. Just trying to advance my slide. It doesn't seem to work at this moment. Yeah, this is about the salaries of people. Now, there you can see the starting salaries and then the salaries of experienced staff. And again, Australia is a good example. 10, 15 years ago, the salaries would have been very low. Today, at least in financial terms, people get quite well paid, and at least decently, as long as you don't compare those salaries with the average salaries of qualified workers. Actually, if you look at graduate salaries, there's in virtually every country except for Luxembourg, you can see that basically people working in early childhood education and care still earn a lot less than people with other graduate qualifications. And that's a challenge, because that gives, it's not the only indication, but it's certainly one indication why people may not work in the field, the people that you may want to work in the field. So I think thinking about this is a very important part. The encouraging figure is this one. In actually the majority of countries, there has been now good alignment between what we pay pre-primary teachers and what we pay primary teachers. In the past, pre-primary would almost always get less well paid. Today, in most countries, where you see sort of the bars not going up and not going down, it basically means we pay people the same salary. And I think that's an encouraging development that really highlights better integration between those kinds of services. And Australia is a good example. We also see, and the red and green dots basically tell you this, is the number of years of education. In most countries, that's been sort of falling into line. We invest the same amount of, education in people going to pre-primary and primary education. I think that's a good kind of news. We also give people various incentives, why to actually, go to continuing education and training. In some countries, these are really well developed, and others not so well. And this is also something to think about. If you want to get people, involved in the design of, and maybe also in the research and the development of the field and professional practices, investing in continued professional development is really, really important. Providing the incentives, and it's not just about financing, but also the work organization where people think about the development of their field. Even, the best education minister in the world cannot solve the problems of, millions of children and 100,000s of teachers and 10,000s of early childhood centers. But if we can mobilize the experience that is in the front line, you get the good practices out of the centers into the system, I think we can do a lot, and we do very little out of this. I think continuing education and training is really, really important. Monitoring, how do we know what's working and what's working best? I think that's something that is only emerging. There are various kind of approaches in place. Unfortunately, from the perspective of the OECD, we see a lot of monitoring on things like, safety, the things that you can easily watch. We see a lot less monitoring on the things that actually matter, that relate to the quality. We look at whether things are safe and so on, that's obvious, but actually there's very little monitoring yet possible in terms of how children are developing, how they are learning, and those things are really different. And there are obviously two angles to this. One is accountability. How do we make sure that we actually obtain the services that we hope for? And more importantly, is the kind of improvement factor in this. And there are various means that are being used, observations, inspections, self-evaluations are important means, parental surveys, what do parents think, beliefs, peer reviews, far too rare yet. How do we actually leverage good experience and poorer facilities? And then also monitoring the views of children themselves. We have actually very few instruments actually that we can use to have the views of children taken into account into this. The question also is, do you do that largely externally, providing an external perspective, or largely internally, relying on the centers themselves to do that? Or how do you balance those kinds of things and with respect to what service? But this is a field, I think, where we still have a long way to go to get a better understanding of the outcomes. When you actually look at why countries monitor this, as I said, it's largely about improvement of the level of service quality, forming policy, informing the general public. It's very little when you look at identifying learning needs of children. Turning that around, I think, is going to be really important. Focusing more on the children. When you look at service quality aspects, even there you can see safety comes first, minimum staff qualifications. Actually, when you look, working conditions comes last. And that tells you again something. We are looking at those things that are very easy to observe, often with a kind of view of minimum standards, and minimum standards then become the standards. And the things that actually matter come often at the lowest. Human resource management. This is about developing staff. It's about leadership. It's about building careers. It comes second to last. Turning that picture around, I think, is a challenge that we still have in front of us. Why? And now I come to this thing. I showed you before. Child development was very low on the priority. Why do we this now? identifying learning needs for children, enhancing child development, improving level of service quality come out on top. But again, our instruments on this are still very underdeveloped. Which of the skills do we monitor? Motor skills, easy to observe, social emotional skills, language and literacy skills come out first. Those are things where we actually starting to have reliable metrics. But this is just a picture for those who do that. In fact, you can see that overall it's quite rare that those things actually are done. Now, we're talking about 15, 16 countries here that have anything in place from over 50. Some of the lessons that we have learned on monitoring, we need to be clear about the purposes and also be explicit about them. Is it for improvement? Is it for accountability? If you're not clear to this, and these have very, very different effects on the behavior of people. How do we actually learn from good practices? How do we develop a good and coherent monitoring framework for different settings that take into account the variability in settings? It is also easy to say, hard to do. This takes time. The opportunity cost of good monitoring are actually quite high. If you want to do that well, basically, people can't do other things and so on. How do we value the voices of stakeholders, of children, of parents in the monitoring process? I think doing that well has really many demands, many requirements. At the OECD, and that's sort of the only thing I really want to say about our work at the OECD, we are trying to do that now. We're actually developing monitoring instruments where we actually try to, what we have done for Pisa for many years now, look at skill dimensions, cognitive skills, but most importantly, most of the focus is really on social and emotional skills, things like trust, like empathy, like pro-social behavior, and we collect a lot of contextual data. Our idea is not, just to measure outcomes. That doesn't lead you very far, but to actually tie those outcomes to the conditions in which, teachers teach, children learn, and so on, with a kind of cumulative yield perspective. That's a new development. That's something that we want to contribute to the field, to provide some metrics in this field, because otherwise we'll end up still always using things that are easy to measure, but not the things that are really important. And this is sort of an upfront investment that we are making in this field. And it's all digitally based, working with play-based kind of facilities. I think technology has really advanced such that we can actually do those things really, really well. The last point I want to talk about is transitions. How do we better integrate the world of learning and the world of play between early childhood education development and primary schooling? And I'm saying this again also from an equity perspective. Often we invest a lot in the children in the early years. We gain a lot of information about those children. And then that information gets completely lost when they make the transition to primary schooling. And that's a really, really a pity. All the experience that we develop, particularly for children with special needs or from disadvantage, all of that does not go into school. Why not? Well, some reasons are difficult to deal with. Primary schooling often thinks, well, we know what to do. Don't bother us. We don't need to know anything. I mean, there are these kinds of mental kind of barriers that are real. We have to sort of talk about that. But some of this is also simply because we don't have the knowledge management and information systems to do that. Some countries have started to address this. The primary teacher may go to the last year of pre-primary education to actually understand something about the children they're going to pick up, or vice versa. Early childhood education teachers participate in primary schooling. There are instruments, but I think there's a lot more that we can do, and it's really important. This data come from England, and I really find it very instructive. It really shows how it is the interaction between the quality of pre-primary education and the quality of primary education that really matters. The reality is a lot of the work that you do in early learning can still be lost. When you see this Heckman curve, you think, I make this investment and it's going to play out. It doesn't play out automatically. Only when we pick this up in primary school, and you can really see how the interaction works out. If you have a low quality primary school, many of the advantages of early learning get lost. And similarly, if you do not have high quality early learning, primary schooling cannot leverage all the potential of children. So getting that transition right is very, very important. And there are important changes. Unfortunately, there are. I must really say, I think this is very, very unfortunate that we have all these barriers, the types of activities children engage in, the way in which they interact with adults, the physical surroundings, and these are arbitrary. We think too much about our institutions. Now, how do schools look? How do early childhood education centers look like? We think too little about the development of children that is continuous, ongoing. That should be at focus, but it's not because simply of history. Now we have to sort of patch these things together in some ways, and that's much harder. We also see that disadvantaged are the ones who struggle most in those transitions, because often the parents do not manage those information flows. If you have a wealthy parent, well-educated parents, they're going to knock on the doors of schools and tell them anything. For disadvantaged, it's less likely the case. But there are also things that come from education itself. We know, including from Pisa data, that teachers have lower expectations for disadvantaged students. They have poorer parent-teacher interactions, and so on. But there are instruments to deal with this. When you look at, for example, curricula that are becoming more aligned, you can see in the majority of countries we now have at least, that's the intended curriculum. We don't know how well this is implemented, but at least in terms of the intentions, good levels of integration. We also see an expanding field in pre-primary education. If you compare between 2011 and 2015, just a few years, but fields, like foreign languages, like digital skills, and so on, ethics, citizenship, social sciences, health and well-being, a lot more attention on those in the last few years. Now, literacy and numeracy have always been there. But when it comes to cognitive development, those curricula have really broadened in a very, very large number of countries. This point I already mentioned, that basically pre-primary teachers have typically more contact time, and that means they have less time for other things than teaching, which shouldn't be less important. Particularly when you think about the social needs of children, you would want that there would be more time available for those kinds of interactions and so on. And that's something that I think most countries still have to deal with, simply because access has expanded very rapidly, and actually developing and paying for stuff is much harder to do. On the good side of the new staff-parent collaboration tends to be higher in preschool than in school. That's a good kind of finding, that actually those kind of parental engagement interactions work better, at least according to what people say themselves. And then let me conclude with just a few good practices that we have observed in tradition. Having a clearly shared view of child development that goes seamlessly through pre-primary to primary education is very important. Having an alignment and balance between what and how children learn is important. Having really good understanding how different children learn differently and how we can support them with different mechanisms. Having strong collaborative practices, basically bringing people together, develop this, aligning pedagogical understanding, and so on. So we actually know what factors make for good transition. Some of them are easy to deal with. Having a good curriculum, an integrated curriculum, having, investing in the staff qualifications. Others are much harder to deal with when it comes to really to pedagogy. Some of these are mental barriers. When you ask basically teachers, what is important, you get a very different answer from a primary teacher than from a pre-primary teacher in terms of, for example, the balance between cognitive, social, and emotional development. I think this tells me that there is a need actually for much, much more closer interaction, not just in government, but in the profession. But overall, I think on the positive side of this is a field really where you have moved the world. I think you have created the level of public awareness that basically now everybody sees the value proposition of this. I think that has been really achieved. I don't think there's any country left which does not believe in early childhood education and care. We have many of the instruments and tools. We still need to work on the financing, making sure that the money reaches those in greatest needs, and also making sure that early childhood education and care is the part of education with the greatest public investment, rather than leveraging tuition from the smallest children. There are a lot of things still to do. There's a lot of work still to be done to develop better instruments for monitoring. But overall, I think a very successful field. Thank you very much.